Tes 1, 2, 3. Tes 1, 2, 3.
Selamat datang di Pusat Riset Pemantik BRIN. Bapak Ibu sekalian, diskusi kita akan dimulai sekitar 10.15. Jadi sekitar 2 menit, ada waktu 2 menit untuk bisa mengambil cemilan dan minuman hangat di belakang. Perhatian Bapak Ibu, mari kita mulai public lecture kita pada hari ini. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan selamat pagi Bapak Ibu sekalian. Perkenalkan, nama saya Pandu Prayoga sebagai Master of Ceremony pada acara hari ini. Welcome to public lecture on uncertainty in forced maritime migration, studying the journeys of Rohingya and Vietnamese boat people, organized by Research Center for Politics, PRP BRIN, August 1st, 2023 at Widyagraha Building, first floor, BRIN Campus, Gatot Subroto, Jakarta. This lecture will discuss the various extrinsic and intrinsic elements that contribute to uncertainty for maritime refugees, drawing on recent problems faced by Rohingya maritime refugees, as well as previous accounts documented by Vietnamese boat people. We believe that this event will contribute fruitfully to the latest discussion on the people, migration, and mobilities in the region. Please stay until the end of the session. There will be a giveaway bags and book. Jadi kepada para audiens diharapkan bertahan sampai akhir karena akan ada giveaway buku dan tas. Goodie bag. Yeah, good news. Before we proceed to the program today, first of all, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to our distinguished speaker, Ibu Prof. Dr. Ance Misbah, Professor of Mobility and Migration at Bielefeld University, Germany, and visiting professor at the Research Center for Politics, BRIN, and the Honorable Moderator, Ibu Prof. Dr. Trinuka Pujastuti, Professor at the Research Center for Politics, BRIN, our Director, Center for Politics, BRIN, Dr. Atika Nur Alami. We also like to thank the seminar intern team and migration research team who organized today's public lecture. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian yang telah hadir pada acara hari ini. Untuk agenda pertama, marilah kita menyanyikan lagu Indonesia Raya. Dimohon kepada hadirin untuk berdiri dan mengikuti video yang ada di layar. Thank you, Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues. Agenda berikutnya adalah pembukaan atau opening remarks dari Dr. Atika Nur Alami sebagai Kepala Pusat Riset Politik BRIN. Dr. Atika Nur Alami, her main interests are Indonesian labor migration, foreign policy, diplomacy, and gender in international relations, particularly to apply a gender lens in analyzing both migration and foreign policy issues. She graduated from Australian National University, Canberra, and wrote a final master thesis about masculine imagery in Australian foreign policy. She earned PhD from National University of Singapore and wrote about infrastructure governance of labor migration, the politics and experiences of Indonesia female domestic workers. Please give a round of applause to Bu Atika. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Pandu. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Selamat pagi, salam sehat dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Yang saya hormati Bapak Ibu pimpinan di lingkungan Badan Riset dan Inovasi Nasional, and also distinguished guest, Profesor Dr. Ance Misbah, Professor of Mobility and Migration from Bielefeld University, Germany. Lalu yang saya hormati Profesor Dr. Trinuke Pujiastuti, peneliti senior di Pusat Riset Politik BRIN yang akan menjadi moderator pada hari ini. Lalu yang saya banggakan juga Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan akademisi, praktisi baik yang hadir langsung di ruangan ini secara offline maupun yang bergabung ya atau menyaksikan melalui live streaming di channel YouTube Pusat Riset Politik BRIN. Pertama-tama kami mengucapkan selamat datang kepada Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan di kampus BRIN ya, Gatot Subroto. Terima kasih banyak telah meluangkan waktu untuk hadir dalam public lecture yang sangat spesial ya dengan Prof. Ance hari ini. Ya, Prof. Ance saat ini merupakan visiting professor di Pusat Riset Politik BRIN. Bersama beliau ya, bersama dengan tim riset migrasi diantaranya Prof. Nuke, saya, Fauzan dan Rizka sedang melakukan kajian terkait dengan digital economy untuk pengungsi asing di Indonesia. Dan selain melakukan kajian bersama dengan tim selama di BRIN kurang lebih 1 bulan ya Prof. Ance, ya hopefully we can extend your stay here in BRIN, ya hopefully ya. Prof. Ance juga akan berbagi pengetahuan dan insight-nya ya mengenai kajian beliau terkait migrasi internasional, khususnya forced migration termasuk pengungsi dan pencari suaka. Dan mungkin 2 minggu lagi ya insya Allah kita akan mengadakan workshop dengan menghadirkan beliau sebagai narasumber untuk sharing pengalaman beliau dalam publikasi internasional, dan saya pikir ini akan menjadi pengalaman yang menarik yang bisa dibagi kepada kita semua. Dan saya pikir bagi akademisi dan pengkaji forced migration, saya yakin karya-karya Bu Ance sudah dikenal luas. Ya, I remember Bu Ance, I met you during my study at NUS, maybe 2018 ya. You presented about forced migration also, and I really enjoy your presentation at the time. Dan paling tidak mungkin kalau kita lihat publikasi Bu Ance 2 tahun terakhir, 2022 dan 2023, meskipun usai pandemi ya, ternyata tidak menyurutkan keaktifan Bu Ance dalam publikasinya. Paling tidak di publikasi terbaru Bu Ance yang tadi ditampilkan di layar, yaitu Indonesia, Negara dan Masyarakat dalam Transisi, menulis bersama Gemma Perde dan Dave McCrae, yang ini sudah ditranslate dalam bahasa Indonesia, sebelumnya terbit dalam bahasa Inggris, dan salah satu penerjemahnya peneliti kami juga, Muhammad Haripin, ya membantu menerjemahkan buku tersebut dalam bahasa Indonesia. Selain itu juga Prof. Ance telah menghasilkan sejumlah tulisan ya, diantaranya edited volume di Research Handbook on Irregular Migration, dan juga guest editor di terbitan terbaru jurnal Advances of Southeast Asian Studies mengenai COVID-19 pandemic, immobilities and migration in Southeast Asia, di mana salah satunya chapter dari tim kami juga ada di sana. Dan dalam kaitan public lecture hari ini, Prof. Ance akan berbagi bersama kita terkait dengan uncertainties in forced maritime migration, khususnya melihat perjalanan dan pengalaman ya orang-orang Rohingya dan Vietnam. Dan melalui public lecture ini, we really hopes that Prof. Ance akan membantu kita to how to make sense of forced maritime migrations from the academic and maybe humanitarian lenses also. Seperti kita ingin melihat sebenarnya bagaimana perjalanan migrasi melalui laut yang dilalui para pengungsi dari Vietnam dan dari Rohingya lalu bagaimana perilaku dan pengalaman mereka ya sebagai pengungsi selama mereka bermigrasi, dan apa saja sebenarnya dalam proses migrasi itu ketidakpastian atau risiko-risiko yang dihadapi oleh para pengungsi selama mereka transit di Indonesia dan harapannya akan resettlement ke negara ketiga. Dan saya pikir konteks maritime transit ini sangat penting dan menarik ya Bu Ance ya. Mungkin belum juga sayangnya belum banyak mendapatkan perhatian di banyak kajian. Mungkin lebih banyak land based transit begitu ya, dan itu juga disampaikan di kajian Bu Ance karena kita tahu bahwa transit di perairan gitu ya, di laut ini problemnya adalah para pengungsi ini tidak hanya mengalami strandedness ya, tapi juga stuckness ya Bu Ance. Di tulisan Bu Ance juga disebut soal itu, dan saya yakin nanti Prof. Ance akan berbagi lebih detail, lebih komprehensif gitu ya, apa saja situasinya seperti apa, dan apa tadi persoalan ketidakpastian dari risiko-risiko yang dihadapi oleh para pengungsi ketika mereka mengalami maritime transit ini ya, di perairan, khususnya di perairan Indonesia. Dan kami berharap juga di akhir lecture ini semoga kita semua ya, para peserta dapat memperoleh ya wawasan dan pengetahuan terkait kajian forced migration. Selain itu juga saya pikir meningkatkan kesadaran kita terkait dengan posisi dan peran dan posisi Indonesia ya sebagai negara transit dalam perjalanan migrasi bagi refugee atau asylum seekers. Dan ini menarik kemudian sampai dengan mereka akhirnya berangkat ke negara ketiga. Mungkin demikian ya, saya tidak perlu berpanjang-panjang, yang dapat saya sampaikan demikian, dan semoga kegiatan lecture hari ini akan berjalan dengan lancar dan mendorong diskusi yang produktif dari Bapak Ibu. Silakan untuk bertanya mumpung ada Prof. Ance di sini dengan berbagai pengalaman beliau ya di lapangan. Dan thank you again Prof. Ance for sharing your insights today, and I think you are indeed a valuable resource for us. And yeah, hopefully the Center for Politics is proud to be associated with you. And yeah, like I said, hopefully you can extend your stay here in Jakarta and in Britain, and have another kind of activities with you. Okay, thank you again also Mbak Nuka, Prof. Nuka for your untuk kesediaannya memoderatori diskusi hari ini. Dan tadi mohon izin mengulang lagi pernyataan atau pesan-pesan sponsor dari moderator bahwa please stay sampai dengan akhir acara. Insya Allah akan ada door prize ya. Tapi mohon maaf ini hanya yang akan hadir offline ya, dan kecuali panitia juga ya. boleh ke panitia juga boleh. Silakan nanti ada door prize untuk pengaturannya nanti monggo Mbak Nuka dan Prof. Ance mungkin bentuknya pertanyaan atau penanya terbaik ya, silakan diajukan, siapkan pertanyaan-pertanyaan terbaik Anda gitu ya kepada Prof. Ance. Oke, mungkin demikian saya pikir selama berdiskusi dengan ini saya menyatakan public lecture hari ini dibuka, dan sekali lagi terima kasih banyak Prof. Ance, Mbak Nuka, Bapak Ibu sekalian, dan juga Dian dan tim seminar yang sudah mempersiapkan kegiatan hari ini dengan baik. Demikian, terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Bu Atika atas sambutannya. Now I would like to invite Bu Nuka to moderate this discussion. Professor Dr. Trinuka Pujastuti is a professor of research at the Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency. She graduated with a Master of Arts in Geography and Environmental Studies with the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Adelaide, with a focus of international migration. She has also graduated as a doctor in the Department of Criminology, Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, University of Indonesia, with a dissertation focusing on people smuggling from Indonesia to Australia. For more than 5 years, she was a part of the ASEAN research team. Bu Nuka's experience in trafficking and smuggling issues has also given her an insight into irregular migration and refugees in Indonesia. Although the research focuses upon Indonesia, it also notes the mobility at a regional basis, particularly at this level of ASEAN. She has also produced position and policy papers for the Indonesian government. Without further ado, Bu Nuke, floor is yours. Beri tepuk tangan buat Bu Nuke.
Thank you, Pandu. Good morning, everybody. It's very honor to be here with you, Professor Anja. I will make an introductions in Bahasa, but you can give your lecture in English, not in Germany. Ya, terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian, khususnya pada kampus politik. Tugas saya diringankan karena tadi sudah diperkenalkan secara sepintas tentang Prof. Anje. Kita mengenal seringkali juga memanggilnya Mbak Anje, yang sudah dikenal di banyak lingkungan akademisi di Indonesia karena penelitian-penelitiannya yang terkait dengan masalah migrasi. Saya ingin mulai dengan memperkenalkan tambahan. Prof. Anje ini lulus doktornya di Australian National University di Research School for Pacific and Asian Studies, Political and Social Change dengan disertasi Long Distance Politics in Transitions, Aceh Diaspora during and after the Homeland Conflict. Masternya didapat dari Humboldt University di Berlin untuk Southeast Asian Studies. Kami mengenal Prof. Anje ini sudah cukup lama, tetapi menjadi intens karena ketika kita submit jurnal, tulisan artikel kami di ASIAS, jadi The Advantage Advantage in Southeast Asia Studies, beliau adalah guest editor. Jadi saya pikir untuk workshop yang akan datang, beliau akan sharing, itu adalah satu hal yang tepat karena beliau sangat terlatih untuk hal-hal itu. Satu hal yang saya pikir kita semua sudah tahu, khususnya untuk scholar yang mendalami masalah forced migration, tulisan beliau pada tahun 2015, yaitu tentang trouble transit asylum seekers stuck in Indonesia. Ini salah satu boleh dibilang bagian yang sangat penting bagi scholar yang ada di Indonesia untuk memahami bagaimana isu-isu asylum seekers yang ada di Indonesia. Dan terakhir yang tadi disampaikan oleh Ibu Atika, Bu Anje terakhir menulis tentang the criminalizations of people smuggling in Indonesia, Australia, Asylum Out of Reach tahun 2022. Saya pikir bukan hanya itu, masih banyak lagi. Kalau dibaca CV-nya nanti 2 jam sendiri, tidak sampai. Ya, tetapi satu hal yang apa yang akan kita bicarakan pada hari ini, kita dengarkan hari ini tentang lecture Ibu Anje. Satu hal poin penting yang saya pikir perlu kita pahami secara bersama adalah istilah dari forced migrations. Untuk Eropa itu hal yang biasa istilah itu, tetapi tidak hanya di Asia, Southeast Asia, di Asia Tenggara, khususnya di Indonesia. Jadi mungkin Ibu Anja akan kita harapkan bisa mengawalinya apa itu dengan forced migrations secara umum. Dan Isu dari forced migrations khususnya adalah forced maritime migrations bukan hal yang baru bagi Indonesia. Kita semua tahu pada masa tahun 1975-76 di mana terjadinya perang Indochina, di mana di situ terjadi boat people yang masuk, salah satunya atau sebagian besar adalah ke Indonesia dan Pulau Galang. Di situ sebenarnya awal mula kita mengenal adanya pengungsi. Kebetulan memang pada istilah di Indonesia kita secara resmi menggunakan istilah yang ada di konvensi pengungsi tahun 1951. Tetapi secara umum orang menyebutnya adalah ada yang masih menyebut dengan illegal migrant, migran gelap dan lain-lainnya. Kita beruntung pada hari ini Ibu Anja akan menyampaikan lecture bagaimana situasi dan kondisi Rohingya, refugee Rohingya yang melalui jalur laut. Dan booming awal itu pada tahun 1915 yaitu adalah Andaman Sea Crisis itu mulai terjadi dan Ibu Anja akan menjelaskan bagaimana faktor-faktor eksternal dan internal yang berkontribusi tetapi juga bisa mereduksi uncertainty itu. Jadi di sini kita akan mendengarkan pula bagaimana sejauh mana sebenarnya secara sejarah itu berulang. Apakah betul ada suatu perbedaan, bukan untuk dibandingkan, tetapi apakah ada perbedaan pada masa zaman boat people dengan kondisi sekarang. Tidak akan lama lagi, saya pikir kita perlu segera mendengarkan bagaimana Ibu Anja memberikan lecture. So without further ado, please Ibu Anja, you have time 45 until 60 minutes. 60, yeah. Okay, you can switch. I can switch off your microphone.
It's a great honor to be here with Prin. And before I start my presentation, I want to use the opportunity to mengucapkan terima kasih sebesar-besarnya to my team. Ibu Nuke, we have known each other for a long time, but last year when we were having coffee in Bakul, she introduces the idea of becoming a visiting fellow. And as you can see, this idea materialized. I'm here now and I'm very much enjoying working with the members of our team, Ibu Atika and Fausan and Rizka. They have been very helpful in preparing the paperwork to come here, and we have very good exchange of ideas. And for the next 3 weeks, we will be conducting interviews and doing some writing together. So I'm very happy to be here. So thank you very much. And of course, also thanks to Pabudi, who takes me to Imigrasi 3 times. Okay, good. So in the following, I would like to draw your attention to maritime mass movements in Southeast Asia. And for a long time, migration studies scholars, they have been only concerned with why people leave and what happens to them after they arrive in a destination country. But they did not pay much attention what happens in the journey, because they thought, the journeys, they're short and uneventful. But actually, that's not the case. When moving between countries, especially as a forced migrant, people face many hurdles and their movements are rarely straightforward. Their journeys, they are staggered, they experience long times of transit. The challenges and the setbacks that they experience, they tend to have massive impacts, because during the journeys, people become depleted of their funds, they run out of money, their health might suffer, and sometimes they might even feel forced to do things that under normal circumstances, they would never be doing. So during these long journeys, however, they also make new acquaintances and they learn new things, and that might also influence their lives in a positive later on if they survive. So
In any case, my supposition here is that the refugee journeys as such influence people's lives later, and therefore we have to attain a better understanding of what happens in the time between leaving the home country and before reaching a place of safety or even resettlement. As Ibu Nuke said, forced migration is a bit of an artificial term because in academia we often distinguish between voluntary migrants, people who want to merantau untuk cari nasib yang lebih baik, and those people who are forced to leave because there's a war, there's conflict, or there's individual persecution. This differentiation makes sense on paper, but often in reality we see that these two categories might actually merge. But because I use the term forced migration because some of the people, they are not, they have not been assessed by the UNHCR on whether they are legally refugees or still asylum seekers. And because we are not too concerned today with these differentiations, whether somebody is seen as a refugee under the convention or not, for today we just used the term forced migration, because the people that I want to talk about, the Rohingya and the Vietnamese people, they left because they did not see any other chance. They left their home countries. So I will start the presentation with giving you some insights on the recent events of the Rohingya and what happens to them, both in the camps in Bangladesh, but also in the Andaman Sea. But then I want to go backwards in time and talk a little bit about the earlier events of the Vietnamese so-called boat people who came here. And I want to particularly focus on what I call forced strandedness, which turns the passengers of refugee boats into the inmates of floating prisons. The uncertainty that I seek to capture results from an imposed strandedness that suspends the spatial temporal interstice of life and death. So because I'm interested in what happens while people on the boat, I want to discuss a few theoretical ideas. What is the difference between uncertainty and risk, and why does this maybe help us to explore those journeys? And if I have enough time, I want to read out some testimonies from Vietnamese boat people at the end of my lecture, and then we can start our discussion. And I would also like to acknowledge my colleague Gerhard Hofstetter, with whom I have been developing some of these ideas together, and with whom I have also been publishing about this in the past. Next slide, please. So basically, I will be going back in time, start with the Rohingya, talk about some theory. Theory is hidden in the middle of the presentation, and then we look at what it was like for the Vietnamese people. Next slide, please. So in a few weeks, we will mark the 6th anniversary of the brutal crackdown by the Myanmar military that forced more than 700,000 people to flee from Myanmar's Rakhine state to the neighboring Bangladesh. As you know, Rohingya are mostly Muslim people. They're an ethnic group that has lived in Myanmar for centuries. However, Myanmar does not recognize them as an official ethnic group. And under the 1982 citizenship law, they are denied citizenship in Myanmar, which renders them the largest identified stateless community in the world. The United Nations have described the Rohingya as the most persecuted minority in the world, and they said that the forced displacement amounted to genocide. Next slide, please. So even before August 2017, when within very few weeks and days, 700,000 people left in a rush from Myanmar. Even before that, there have been a number of mass exodus. We remember 1978, again in the 1990s, Rohingya were pushed out by the Myanmarese. So they have been looking for safety in other places. And here on this map, you can see where else they have gone, either as refugees, as forced migrants, or in some cases also as labor migrants. The number for Myanmar itself is probably a bit outdated. It says less than 1 million of Rohingya still residing in Myanmar. It's probably closer to 600,000 now, because people keep leaving from the horrible conditions that they're facing in their home country. Now, within Southeast Asia, it is actually Malaysia that has become the most desirable destination for Rohingya. And the reason is that in the past, Malaysia was rather lenient with its immigration law enforcement to some refugees. Not least, there is a great need for cheap disposable labor in the 3D job sector. But we have also seen that Malaysia is very inconsistent with its attitude. So particularly during the COVID pandemic, the arrival of refugee boats became more difficult because migration law was strictly enforced. Nevertheless, for many Rohingya, Malaysia is still the promised land. It's a Muslim country with good economic prospects. And also there's already 150,000 Rohingya living there. And they have started to build a community where other people are hoping to integrate into. Next slide, please. Thanks. So, okay, so Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, we have a number of refugee camps, and there's more than 1 million Rohingya living in the Cox's Bazar region. And these camps have now become some of the largest and most densely populated in the world. The people who live in these camps, they face very difficult living conditions, and they are under constant threat of from natural disasters, floods, kebakaran. The camps are terribly overcrowded. They lack sufficient sanitation. The black market is thriving, and survival sex is very common, particularly for young girls. The Bangladesh government has been pushing the Rohingya to go home, to go back to Myanmar. But Myanmar is a very unsafe place for them to go because the government does not want to acknowledge them as citizens. On top of this, in February 2021, the Myanmar junta, in February 2021, the Myanmar junta, who is accused of crimes against humanity against the Rohingya, has also taken control of the country in a military coup. When we talk about return, I think it's important to acknowledge that many villages where the Rohingya came from, they do no longer exist. The military has taken over these villages. They have burned down some of the infrastructure. So going home, going back to Myanmar is becoming actually more and more difficult, because going home to what? So the longer the displacement lasts, the more the chances of return actually diminish. So in the past, there have been attempts to convince the Rohingya, but all of them have failed. But on the other hand, Bangladesh has really made it clear we will not host the Rohingya forever. And in one way, they are increasing pressure by moving some refugees from the camps in Cox's Bazar to an island. You can see an image on that slide. Out in the sea, there are islands. They are basically made of sediments. 40 years ago, there was no such islands. These are just stilled islands. They consist of sediments that come from the upper stream. They are very flat. Even though they have managed to build a camp there, you can imagine what life on such a flat island could mean. Because if there's floods or storm, you might as well go under. And also this island Bhasan Char is actually quite far from the mainland, which in a way turns it again in some kind of prison island. So for these reasons of not being able to go back to their villages in Myanmar, in Rakhine, but also because the situation in Bangladesh is becoming intolerable, we can see that there are now such things that migration scholars refer to as secondary movements. Next slide, please. So people are taking their destiny into their own hands. So, and secondary movement means that people, for a number of reasons, they do not stay in the first country of asylum, but they try to reach other places. And usually the UNHCR or the refugee handling bodies, they're not too happy about these secondary movements because it makes managing refugees difficult. But also the further they move away from their country of origin, the fewer the chances of actually returning at some point. Now, between 2012 and 2022, it's estimated that about 120,000 Rohingya embarked on secondary movements to Malaysia with the help of a well-developed transnational operating smuggling and trafficking infrastructure. Smuggling infrastructure, of course, involves a great number of different actors. We have known that there are some Indonesian fishermen involved in that, but also Thai military officials. Some of them have been convicted in 2016, but that usually does not do much damage because these actors can be easily replaced. There's also suspicions that Malaysian officials have been involved in facilitating these movements. But in Malaysia, we have not seen any legal prosecutions so far. Anyway, it's important to be aware that people smuggling or trafficking, it is a demand-driven phenomenon. It doesn't exist because there's like Oknum or people who see an opportunity. It evolves because there is a need. People want to leave or they see no other chance than getting on a boat because the situation in the place where they are has become unbearable. Next slide, please. Now, in order to reach Malaysia, there are, of course, different ways. People can either travel via land or they can go by boat, and sometimes it's a combination of both. Those journeys, particularly from Bangladesh, they tend to be long, hazardous, risky, costly. Anything can happen along the way. Until 2015, it was probably the case that more people traveled via land. But then you might remember the news that came out about the mass graves that were discovered at the Thai-Malaysian border. And the majority of victims, and you can see this on the photo, like the bones and the skulls, they were suspected to be Rohingya. And after that revelation, more and more people decided to use boats in order to reach Malaysia. But because border control then started to increase also in the sea, we saw that these journeys became quite long because countries did not want those Rohingya people to disembark. They kept pushing them back. And some observers talked about a human ping pong, sending people back and forth, but not letting them come on land. Despite the increased border control, both at land, but also on sea, strangely enough, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, we saw an increase of Rohingya. The numbers were going up, more boats were coming, even though the whole world was standing still. Like here in Indonesia, in Jakarta, probably everybody stays at home. Germany, we stay at home, but the Rohingya, they actually got back on boats. Now, let me tell you the story of 5 boats, a story that happened at the end of November in 2022. So 5 overcrowded boats with Rohingya refugees set sail to reach faraway Malaysia. But none of those 5 boats ever reached their destiny. The first boat got into distress a few days after the start of the voyage. The 154 passengers were saved from drowning by a Vietnamese flagged ship, but they were subsequently handed over to the Myanmar Navy by the Vietnamese authorities. Nobody actually knows about their whereabouts, but possibly they are imprisoned for unauthorized travel. So yes, people were rescued from drowning, but what actually happened during this rescue was handing them back to the hands of those people who persecute them. In a way, this is refoulement, and I will talk about this later. But it's like dari mulut buaya ke mulut harimau. So, so the second boat with 105 passengers went off course because the engine failed. Mati mesin. And then after 10 days, the Sri Lankan Navy came to their aid, and they took them to Jaffna in Sri Lanka, but there they were arrested. It's unclear what the government in Colombo is intending to do with them. But even though they never wanted to come to Sri Lanka, they were taken by the Navy. They still have been imprisoned for irregular migration, which is a bit questionable here, right? Now, the third boat, basically since mid-December, 2 weeks after the boat left, the family members stopped having radio contact. And it's believed that that boat sank with all the people on board, about 180 people. In the meantime, the Associated Press published the final phone call of the woman who was on board of this boat. She called her husband, who was living in Malaysia. She was telling him we're drowning, but then the connection broke down, and it was the last sign of life that the people heard from that boat. Now, the two last boats, with together 230 passengers, made their way to Indonesia, where they were finally allowed to disembark in Aceh. Earlier, the passengers they were telling, they had been met by an Indian Navy ship who presented them with some food, but according to the passengers, the Indian Navy transported the boat into Indonesian territorial waters so that they would no longer be responsible. And at least 26 people died during those crossings. We can see there is a great amount of uncertainty. People start their journeys. They don't know, will I ever arrive in the place that I want to go to? What will happen to me during the journey? Now, I want to talk about a number of factors that contribute to this uncertainty. And in order to understand what's happening here, we must know, or we must be aware, that when we talk the international asylum regime, that this is anchored in a territorial basis. This means in order to ask for asylum, to minta suaka, you actually have to arrive in another country. You cannot apply for asylum in your home country. You cannot apply for asylum when you're out at sea, but you actually must be in the country in order to ask for protection. Only if you reach another state, that state becomes obliged to avoid refoulement. And refoulement means sending people back to where they have to fear for their lives. And it's true that many countries have not signed the International Refugee Convention, but non-refoulement, the rule to not send people back to danger, is actually customary law. So it's also even countries that are not party to the Refugee Convention have to obey to this law. But what is happening here is that by preventing people to come to land, states can circumvent the non-refoulement obligations. If you're not on land, you cannot ask for protection. So what is happening here is that a number of countries have created so-called non-entrée politics. They prevent the arrival, the disembarkation of people in their national territories. And therefore, they also prevent people asking for protection. Now, the politics of rejection at sea creates a new quality of what we call strandedness. Because in the beginning, people get on a boat, and the boat for them is a vehicle of escape. But when they are stranded, the boat basically transforms and becomes a floating prison. They are captured inside that boat. And even though every now and then we see maritime patrols that would supply refugee boats with food and water, fuel sometimes even help them to repair the engines, as long as they force them to continue their search for alternative destinations, people remain in this state of strandedness. They are basically captured in a seascape, in a sea prison, for an undetermined period of time. And the chance of survival, of course, gets smaller and smaller. So time is a very important factor here when we talk about strandedness. Now, I already mentioned increased border protection and deterrence policies by a number of Southeast Asian states. And every now and then, there is a crisis. That means when many boats get stranded at sea. And this has happened in the Andaman Sea crisis that Ibu Nuke mentioned before. That was probably so far the most recognized lethal deadlock so far. And the crisis was constituted by the denial of access to the territory of potential destination countries. And also the diversion to other undetermined destinations with the help of active towbacks and also more indirect driftbacks. And I explain the difference in a second. So these deterrence measures were designed to make the cost-benefit analysis for future boat people so unfavorable that they would abandon their plans to travel by boat. So the logic behind preventing boats and refugees coming to land is that this sends out a message to people back in the camp: do not get on a boat. So this group of people is immediately punished in order to tell a message to an entirely different group that is basically constituting a potential group of boat people. Now, despite these measures, despite this standoff and the pushbacks, nevertheless, the number of refugee boats heading to Southeast Asia, as I mentioned before, increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, but so did also the pushbacks. So in 2020, more than 3,500 people attempted the deadly sea crossings. We know of at least 39 boats, and that is a 360% increase compared to the year before. But what used to be a relatively short journey has now become like really long and can take up to 7 months. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a little moment and talk a little bit more about this terminology, because some of you might not be too familiar. So deterrence generally is an act of making somebody to decide not to do something. It's an act of preventing a particular act or behavior from happening. So in regard to crime deterrence, the threat of punishment is so severe that people will abstain from committing it. And this is a policy or a measure that many governments have embraced, but it's not really working. You can tell the Rohingya, you can tell these people not to get on boats. They're probably not going to listen, because the circumstances that they face in the camps or on Basan Char, they are so bad that they will not listen to these warnings. So they will go anyway. So in addition to the politics of deterrence, don't come here, there is the more, drastic non-entree policies, which I mentioned before. So, of course, the countries in Southeast Asia are not the only ones who have embraced these practices. They have been developed and tested in many other countries around the world. The US is probably leading. Australia is also very powerful in exercising these non-entree politics. But it's a means, even for the countries who have signed the Refugee Convention, to prevent people from coming to their shores and for asking for protection. Another set of how uncertainty is increased out there on the sea is non-assistance. And non-assistance is a rather passive way of preventing boat refugees from coming to land. Some of you will know that under international law, the law of the sea, rescue is compulsory, not just to the search and rescue teams, but any bypassing boat has to render assistance if they come across an emergency situation. Even if this is a commercial ship, a private yacht, if you see another vessel in an emergency, you have to render help. There's no discussion, you have to. That's the basic of the maritime international law. But what we find is more often nowadays, those calls for help, they are being ignored entirely. And we have testimonies from refugees who have seen other boats passing by. They could see them, they were waving, nothing happened. Or what also happens is that rescue is being delayed deliberately. So they just take their time and ya besok aja, nanti dulu, until help is actually being provided. And we do have a lot of reports about this happening in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so non-assistant is a basically a passive approach of making sure that boat refugees don't come to land. But there are, of course, more active measures. And here, let me explain briefly the different forms of pushback. So basically, we're talking about three different kinds. On the one hand, we have the turnbacks that refugee boats might be stopped in the middle of the ocean by a Navy boat, and they will be told, turn around, go the other way. Australia is very much known for this. They have like cardboards with all different languages. So when they encounter a boat that is carrying refugees, they would just say like pulang dulu or like what other language. Because in the international waters, they're not supposed to tell other people what to do. In theory, they enjoy free movement at the international waters, but they will try to convince them to turn away anyway. Now, if these turnbacks don't work, there's also towbacks. And towbacks means that a custom or Navy boat will attach a rope around the refugee boat, and then they actually actively pull them. They pull them back into international waters, and then dilepas. And then again, testimonies from refugees who have seen that happening to them. The last form of pushback, and that's probably the most vicious one, is what I call driftbacks. And this is when, for example, and again, we have evidence from 2009, when the Thai Navy disabled a number of Rohingya boats by basically taking away the engines. And they then let the boats drift in the ocean. We don't know how many people died, but we do know that some of the people actually survived, and they drifted as far as the Nicobar Islands. So Thailand, Nicobar Islands, that is a really long distance. Now, so we have these active pushbacks that again increase the uncertainty out at the sea. And as you can see, time is being used as a weapon. What constitutes strandedness is that this is not just 1 or 2 days, but it can be 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, many months. So time is weaponized in the governance of maritime migration. And the ocean, which holds the promise of free navigation, suddenly becomes a carceral seascape. It becomes a prison. Suddenly, the sea is unreachable for people from land. NGOs can't do much. Ordinary civilians, activists, they can't do anything because it's too far away. So what makes maritime migration so different is that on the sea and the ocean, different and other rules apply. And what happens there is not necessarily subordinated to the sovereign cage of a single state, but it's truly international. And the freedom is to exercise sovereign power is being used by individual states. And often they prioritize migration interests over human rights. Okay, now back to the prolonged journeys. So I mentioned that the numbers of Rohingya boats coming to Malaysia, they went up, and so did the pushback. So we know that at least 22 Rohingya boats were pushed back only in May and June in 2022. And I want to read out this statement by a young guy who eventually landed in Indonesia. And he had been out on a boat for 7 months. 7 months at the sea, imagine not much food, drinking rainwater, facing the sun, the heat. And he said, we had hardly anything to eat, and we were so hungry that sometimes we forgot our own names. I find this quite touching. They were so exhausted, they could not even remember their own names. That kind of tells you what the cognitive impacts are of a prolonged starvation. Now, the situation of this prolonged strandedness of the Rohingya and the Andaman Sea is, of course, also exploited by those people who actually organize the journeys. Whenever they cannot disembark, whenever they cannot go on land, that means that the facilitators, the traffickers or the smugglers, whatever you want to call them, they need to provide more food or more water. In order to pay for that, Rohingya on those boats, of course, they don't bring money, they don't have cash. The only way to pay for that is to then call relatives in Malaysia and make them send money to these traffickers. We also know that these people often use violence to extract the money, because usually imagine the Rohingya who are living in Malaysia, they are in a precarious situation. They're not earning a lot of money. So having to pay another 1,000, 2,000 ringgit is a big deal for them. And again, I don't think this happens necessarily because traffickers or smugglers are evil people, but they have to somehow provide for the people who cannot come to land. Okay, now comes the theory session. The question here is how can we understand, how can we capture uncertainty? And what is uncertainty to begin with? I mean, usually people talk about risks, and risk is like the potential negative outcome of an action. And we can calculate risks. Basically, a risk is the probability of an event times the damage of an event. And we can, in a way, prepare if we know the risks. If we know what the risk is of dehydration, we bring more water. If we face the risk of drowning, well, maybe it's better to learn how to swim. But uncertainty is different from risk. Uncertainty is the broader set of unknowns that might happen, and the outcomes often cannot be calculated. In theory, risk could be good and bad, but generally we tend to avoid them. Better safe than sorry, that's what we think. Now, why are social science interested in the concept of uncertainty? Why do we need to know? And there are basically two things that make uncertainty relevant for us. And that's to understand decision making. How do people decide? Why do they decide to get on boats if they know that the risk of dying is so high? What kind of knowledge do they have that they base their decisions upon? Uncertainty, when we talk about migration, has basically two sources. The first source is imperfect knowledge. We can't know anything. We can't know everything of all the different possibilities of what might happen out there in the sea. And that of course raises the issue that there are competing approaches to understand how knowledge is constituted, like how much do people in Bangladesh know? What kind of information is given to them? And the second source of uncertainty is that nobody can possibly predict the future. But still people will have to prepare or adjust facing this uncertainty. And we could say there is an epistemological uncertainty that something that people should know, they don't know. But there's also this kind of ontological uncertainty. Things, they're simply unknowable. Like as much as you try, you will not come to understand. So in situations of uncertainty, people's behavior is often not consistent with rational choice theory, but they still might behave in somehow predictable ways. Essentially, they cling on the flimsiest piece of evidence to impose a sense of certainty in a situation of objective uncertainty. But that also means that they often overestimate the benefits and they underestimate the costs of their journey. In the research that I'm conducting, I'm mostly interested on how people adopt to different kinds of uncertainty. How do they behave as individuals or as a group on a boat in order to deal with all these different risks, the extrinsic risks that are the results of policies, but also the risks that materialize because people are on board for a long time in a really squeezed place and under really difficult circumstances. And I want to know whether or not there are ways to minimize risks and therefore also uncertainties, either through individual modes of coping or collective modes of coping. So when we look at the literature, there's a lot of literature on migration and risk, but unfortunately, they only talk about the risks of the destination countries, whether the living standards or the salaries are good enough to justify the investment of migration. There's quite a bit of literature coming forward about the extrinsic factors of uncertainty, and especially about the hostile bordering regimes in the Mediterranean, but also in other regions. But there's very little about the intrinsic uncertainty that is basically shaped by the passengers and the people on board of those boats themselves. And when we talk about boats, we really have to be aware that there are these enclosed spaces, tiny nutshells in the large ocean, which itself is a non-space because it's a border to them. They can't just leave the boat. If you're fed up with the situation, you don't like it, well, you will have to stay and wait what comes next. So the boats, they're almost like a moving location of a collective experience. You're all in this together. You're all in the same boat, literally. And when these journeys are so long, we see that new hierarchies emerge. People have probably already a number of hierarchies before they get on the boats, but when it comes to being and living together on the boat, new roles emerge. So boats, in a way, they're not just vehicles of transport. Boats are very special places, and there is a reason why we, even in our, mythic imaginations, we talk about boats. Noah's Ark, when he was trying to rescue all the animals from the flood. They give us these ideas of what it means to be on a boat and to hope to rescue and find or save our lives. The boat can stand for the best, but also the worst of social life. The boat is a means of escape, but as I mentioned before, it can also turn into a floating prison from which people are unable to leave, and they linger under unbearable conditions. And in the worst case, it's not just a floating prison, but it can become a floating coffin. Passengers usually cannot choose their fellow passengers on board. That makes the boat, in a way, a macabre political economy in which race, gender, class intersects, and it determines what role you will play on the board. And for example, it's not coincidence that women and children often have to sit at the bottom of the boat. Okay, there they don't face the sun, but they will have to inhale all the asap, the smoke from the engine. If there's some food coming, from the smugglers, it probably is habis sampai ke bawah. So in a way, there is a steep hierarchy of what happens depending on where you are in the boat. If the boat drowns and you're sitting at the bottom, there's no way for you to even get out. So I think these dynamics make it really important to see what happens in these boats, particularly because the journey is becoming longer and longer. Okay, so now how do we deal with risks and uncertainties? I mean, as I said, people are in the same boat, but does this actually mean that they are acting as a group? Can we assume that a community of suffering, they're all suffering from the same destiny, that they also become a community of solidarity? Or is it actually the opposite, that people start to turn against each other and fight over the limited resources that are available to them? What happens if solidarity comes second? Now, when I was looking up whether the meaning of risk comes from, I learned just recently that for a long time people thought risk is a Latin word that made its way into Italian and French, but then actually the etymology of the word is much older, and in Arabic, in the language of the Quran, they also talk about risk, and it has a very different meaning. It's, if I understand it correctly, it's a religious principle that God gives, or that God provides people with material and spiritual goods for when they go on a long journey. But the moment it was adopted by the European language, it kind of changed its meaning, and it became much more associated with maritime and commercial endeavors. And this is also why the Italian tradespeople, they invented such a system as insurance. In the 14th century, we can see that people who went on the long trade journeys, they got together and had an insurance in case they were facing risks. There would be a mechanism to share the risk, for example, for the risk of losing all the goods. And for me, this is a very interesting thing to use also for the more contemporary boat journeys, because the question is whether they also are some kind of risk community. So risk community is usually referring to the liabilities when a boat is drowning and the freight and the passengers have to be saved. It's okay in order to save life to let go of the barang, the goods. So the contemporary usage of risk community is, and I quote, an association of people which constitutes itself on an at least implied promise of mutual help in the event of an accident. So when you are together in a very dangerous situation, you believe that when you promise each other to help each other, you have the bestest chances of survival. Because in a way, everybody faces the same risk, the risk of drowning, the risk of dying of hunger, of dehydration, that gives you a sense of community. But it would also be a little bit naive to ignore that age and gender and all the other factors have no impact. And there might not be such a sense of equality amongst the boat passengers. Not everybody on board has the same capacity to fend for him or herself. In contrast, we might also see that the different physical and psychological constitution of the passengers instigate some kind of anarchic situation on board. And there is a chance that people will help each other, that there will be some sense of solidarity, but there could also be tension and competition and aggression. So it is generally anticipated that collaboration will improve the chances for survival, but for example, if there's a shipwreck or you go off course or the engine falls. But I think it's also important to not ignore that some people will basically take their own advantage by prioritizing their own survival. And they will not help the fellow passengers. And in this moment, of course, the risk community collapses. Now, how do we study the behavior of passengers? It's very difficult to ask Rohingya people what happened to them when they were out at sea. They're often extremely traumatized and they find it very hard to talk about what just happened to them. And often when we want to talk to them, they're not in a safe place. They're either in a camp or they're in the Malaysian detention center. So asking them to open up to us makes it really difficult. Some of them might even own the smuggler, so they don't want to talk about it because information could come out and then they would have to pay the costs. So studying the Rohingya is, for the time being, very difficult. But there have been, of course, previous generations of maritime migration in Southeast Asia, and Ivo Nuke mentioned already the Vietnamese boat people who started coming in the 1970s. And, you know, they are now very old and they have produced a lot of autobiographies and books. There's a lot of oral history projects, and they, in a way, allow us to learn a little bit on what happens during these boat journeys. But it takes a long time until people can actually open up. Maybe just to give you some background to why the Vietnamese people came to Southeast Asia, that in 1975, after the fall of Saigon, after the North Vietnamese army was successful driving out the American military, about 2 million people left Vietnam. And of these 2 million people, maybe it's estimated that 800,000 actually got on boats. They came to countries such as Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, but also Hong Kong, and some went all the way to Australia. We don't have definite numbers of deaths at sea, but the UNHCR estimates that it might be as many as 200,000 people who died at sea. And if you look at the picture, there's actually not much of a difference with the Rohingya today. The only difference, this is black and white, and nowadays we have colored photos. The boats are just as overcrowded, unseaworthy, and the people have become the ultimate image of pity. So, but there are, of course, some differences with these earlier boat journeys. They varied in scale and infrastructure. First of all, back then, there were no people smugglers or traffickers. There was no such infrastructures. Some of the Vietnamese, they even had to build their own boats. Some later on traveled with larger trawlers. And over time, the people smuggling industry started to evolve because there was a demand. A lot of Vietnamese people reported that when they were out in the water, ships passed by but did not help them. They ignored their distress calls. So in a way, that reminds us a little bit of what's happening today. But about 600,000 people who have been rescued were eventually resettled in about 20 countries around the world. And that makes the situation of the Vietnamese boat people quite different from the Rohingya, because the international community actually paid much more attention. The Vietnamese boats, they often did not bring enough food. They could not accumulate a lot of preparation because that would have immediately caused a lot of suspicion in Vietnam. Again, different with the Vietnamese boats is they often traveled as families. So they knew everybody on board. That's quite different from the Rohingya. There, the passengers, there are quite a mix, and there's not very strong ties between them, which of course is important when we talk about solidarity later on during the journey. Okay, so what was the biggest risk for the Vietnamese back then? The first one being taken back to Vietnam. And there's some stories that they were already out in the ocean. They were rescued, but by the wrong boat. For example, a Russian vessel would come and rescue them and take them back to Vietnam. The second biggest fear probably was piracy. And that was a very unique risk that the Vietnamese had to encounter. Just to give you some numbers, of the 450 boats carrying Vietnamese people that arrived in Thailand, about 349 had been attacked by pirates. More than 200 women had been abducted, and 800 people were dead or missing. Now, pirates, of course, is again a very colorful category, because often these pirates were ordinary fishermen who were expecting some reward for if they offered help. Now, I don't know, time is probably up, but I wanted to read maybe one testimony from a Vietnamese person, and then I will be quiet. Okay, which one? All right, this one maybe. So these testimonies, they are taken from the oral history depositories that have been accumulated over the last couple of decades. So I'm reading you the story of a man who's maybe 70-year-old and how he remembers being on the boat in the 70s. And of course, it's his history, it's his memory. We don't know whether it's true or not, but this is what he has to say. So finally, after 5 days, a Malaysian fishing boat approached us. And they are not pirates, but they want money. So they asked me for gold in exchange for food and water, and in exchange to be pulled back to the shore. So I have to make a deal with them. And they don't speak English. I only speak a little, but we can communicate well. Only thing they demand is gold and girl. Okay, gold, but girl, I say, girl, no. But they say no, they want both. If we don't provide both, they will not pull us to the shore. So I give them all the gold, and they give us some water and food. But they say, give us a girl, or we will not pull you. I don't know what to do. I talk to my people. And then one girl, I don't know why, she volunteers and says she will go. And I talk to this girl, and I talk to the Malaysian fishing people over there, and they say, okay, give us this girl. But I don't want to send just one girl. I asked them whether I can send this girl and some other men. And then 10 of us go over to the other ship. This is my plan. If something happens to the girls, our people will be there. But luckily, the fishermen over there, they are not really bad. They just want to do flirting with the girls, some talking. We still give them gold, whatever they want. We are trying to collect all. And finally, 3 days after negotiation, hanging around and talking, finally, they pull us to the shore. So for me, this is a very interesting story. This girl becomes a volunteer. She goes with the Malaysian fishermen. She basically sacrifices her safety for the well-being of this group. We don't have the account of the girl. We don't know why she did it. We don't know what actually happened to her. Maybe it was more than just flirting. But when it comes to the dynamic of what happens on board and how some people have to maybe face greater pain than others, I find this is a very insightful story. Okay, now, well, my time is up and we still want to have some little discussion. So let me just give you the 3 basic take-home messages. So I hope that you have learned with me that the ocean, when we talk about maritime mass migration, has a very ambivalent role. It connects, but it also divides. Mobility is not just equated with freedom and liberty, but actually mobility is often impeded against all the promises. So an uncertainty for these maritime refugees, it's a fundamental experience. It will change their entire life. But it is also increasingly used as a governing tool against maritime migration. Okay, well, Thank you very much for your attention. And now I look very much forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Mbak Ance. I think this is a very interesting lecture because we learn a lot about the concept of uncertainty with what you call about the Rohingya, and you give show that the situations are also in 2000 in what do you call Indo-China conflict. I think it's time for us, if you have any, jika ada yang ingin bertanya, memberikan komentar, ada mungkin 2 atau 3 orang ingin bertanya. Saya tulis dulu. Sasa, and then Ibu siapa? Oh, Ibu Evi. Satu lagi mungkin. Ada lagi? Oke, kalau begitu mungkin silahkan Sasa. Oh, Bapak siapa? Oh, Pak Ibnu. Oke, langsung saja. Bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia atau bahasa Inggris. Silahkan.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Misbah, for this very eye-opening presentation. What I want to ask is, when we talk about, I want to ask 2 things. When we talk about Rohingyas, previously we have this seminar with Japan Foundation. One of the speakers also talk about Rohingya and their refugee status. That sometimes when academics talks about Rohingya and what happened in the field, it's likely to be an eye-opening presentation, but also an eye-shutting presentation for the government, because what can they do? Like you said, the military boats might give them food and everything, but what they said is just don't come to our shores. I mean, like, you can stay there. We will give you food and waters based on our humanities and everything like that. But where does it stop? I mean, like, do you see any final situation for these people who stranded at the sea? And the second one is there any political representation for Rohingyas people? I mean, like, and when we talk about them, like you said, in Vietnam case, the boat is they are probably like the journey is based on like families and everything like that, and also maybe they have movement, like international movement on who is have political voice that can endorse them. But what about these people? Do they have this political endorsement by the Rohingya people themselves? Not, I mean, like, not by the non-governmental organization. Like, we all know that there's many who are care about these people, but do they actually have their own political representation? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the very enlightening presentation. I just want to ask you whether you are familiar with the Giorgio Agamben homosexual, because when you describe about these Rohingya immigrants, I suddenly remember about Giorgio Agamben's concept of homosexual. I think they are a perfect example of homosexual, in which the states, I mean, almost all of the states are built upon the idea of preserving human rights. But which human rights? Because certain human rights are exactly abandoned. So Agamben term it like the paradox of sovereignty. So in which like what they do is legal because they do the deterrent strategies and what the Indian both do is like mengarahkan, directing the boat into another territory, and it's not against the law at all. I mean, it's legal in some way, but it's against the human rights that they are believing or that build their nation state. So I just want to probably I would take a sharper stand. Then you say that I think it's what is it, abandonment of human rights for certain groups, I think. So that's the comments, but probably I just want to ask if you are familiar with Agamben. Do you think Agamben ideas of what is it, bare life is helpful in this sense for Rohingya? Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, but I want to ask with the bahasa ya. Ya, tadi kita sudah dengar penerimaan atau perlakuan negara-negara Asia Tenggara terhadap refugee baik yang terpaksa atau dengan kehendak sendiri. Apakah ada pengalaman penelitian tentang bagaimana penerimaan negara Barat atau Amerika ya terhadap refugee yang terdampar begitu? Apakah sudah sesuai dengan peraturan internasional? Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you. Excellent questions. I feel like I'm now being examined. Okay, so I mean, it's always a good question, like what can they do? What can we do? What can our government do? What can the international community do? I probably would try to answer this question with another question by saying, like, what are the costs of the status quo? Like, what's the worst case? What will happen to people who are disiksa, disingkir, marginalisasi, like terus menerus, like, and I mean, I'm not a fortune teller. I can't know what the future will bring, but often what happens is if people are in a very desperate situation, increasingly desperate, they might also embrace more desperate means to draw attention to their situation. And of course, there is a risk of like increasing militancy amongst the Rohingya, and that's something I guess nobody wants to see happening. So when we think about what can we do, what needs to be done, I think it's also anticipating the costs of not doing enough. Now, of course, there has been for the last 6 years so many ASEAN meetings. Nobody can possibly keep track of all these discussions and good intentions, but there is essentially a stalemate, like nobody can influence what is happening in Myanmar. Ibu Retno had for a certain period of time extremely good backdoor channels. She was going there, she was going to the camps. Indonesia has delivered a lot of humanitarian aid, but it has not necessarily resulted in the outcome that was desired, and especially not that was desired by the Rohingya. And I think the coup that happened last year probably ruined a number of like the good prospects and the initial things that had been started. So I guess what can be done? To my mind, I think it's probably time to not just dream about the return. Like the longer this takes, the return becomes probably more difficult to facilitate. So it's probably finding solutions of local integration or perhaps resettlement elsewhere. Now, I know that the neighboring countries of Bangladesh, including Southeast Asian countries, they are very reluctant towards these suggestions. They don't want to take the burden, but they also don't want Myanmar to get away with genocide and being able to expel unwanted ethnic groups. But Mao Tida Mao, I think that's probably what's going to happen. And the more or the sooner there is going to be a proactive way of helping these people, the better it can be implemented. Rather, if not, then we're going to see a never-ending ad hoc mannerism dealing with this Rohingya. And they're not coming here for the first time. They have been coming here for like more than 10 years now. So it's probably good to establish a way of dealing with them. There's 1 million people in the camps. I don't think they will all come, but I don't know, the next monsoon season could probably trigger a new outflow of boats. Okay. Yeah, but of course, I'm also interested if you know more about what's happening with ASEAN or what kind of plans or possibilities are being discussed. Would be interesting to learn a little bit more about this. Homosaka and Agamben, Bear Life. I must say, I get this question quite often. Why don't you quote Agamben? That's a textbook example of biopolitics and bare life. And it's true. I mean, Agamben developed his theoretical framework mostly talking about the inhabitants of camps, concentration camps, and people being reduced to nothing but the bare life. They're being completely depleted of human rights, maybe even human agency. And at first I thought, yeah, that's very convincing. But then again, Agamben has also been criticized by maybe a form of additional victimization by describing people only as passive victims. We might actually take away any potential of resistance, the potential of adoption. And that's why I'm not too keen on adopting this perspective of bare life. Is I do think when people are on the boats facing dehydration, starvation, whatever, they are not with much what they can do. And still, I would not want to reduce them to objects, but I would always want to keep the option that there's something they could do, that there is something they could try, as tiny as the possibility might be. But yeah, I do think that within the smallest scale of agency, we need to accredit it to the Rohingya and to the Vietnamese. You know, like after all, some are survivors, and some people manage to come through. The other comment that you made about like a lot of these deterrence policies, they're legal. Yes and no. I mean, many states claim they are legal or they have introduced laws that make them legal. But the question, of course, is, are they morally right? So I would put a big question mark there. But also, even about the legality, I'm not entirely sure. Many countries don't necessarily show a lot of transparency when it comes to interceptions and turnbacks. We don't know exactly where they happen. Did they indeed happen in the territorial sea, or did they happen in the international sea? Because each part of the sea is governed by very different rules and regulations. And before we don't know the exact place of interception and turnback, I would probably be careful to assume legality here. I think maybe what could provide a new and fresh way of thinking is when it comes to what shall we do, how can we get out of this stagnation, is also like that we could imagine like, well, if I was ever in a position like this, what would I want people to do? Like when we think about reciprocity, and the ancient maritime law is very much based on reciprocity. You help me and I help you. Then this can basically help to build a mutual, more beneficial system. We don't know who of us is going to be hit by a calamity, you know, like who will need help, who will not be able to help him or herself next. But we could assume it's me, or maybe it's you. Because we don't know, we better try to be helpful, because once I have helped you, you might help me, and vice versa. So, and this is very much the idea that governs maritime rescue. Anybody could be hit by a storm, anybody could have an engine failure, or could like kena karang, or all the dangers that are all out there. So what increases the chances for survival is the idea that mutual help produces strong cohesion that will last from generation to the next, from one generation to the next. So this is the idea of maybe thinking more in a long-term perspective. What are the benefits of helping people now? What good can that bring in the future? And in a way that probably might also lead to the third question that you asked about, like the international reactions and what has happened to the Vietnamese so-called boat people, and whether this could maybe also serve as a model to convince more people to carry out more active search and rescue missions. Now, I mentioned before, the international community was very eager, at least in the beginning, to help the Vietnamese, because they were running away from a communist system during the Cold War. That made them the perfect victims. You help them, and you're going to look like the perfect savior, because you can also discredit the Vietnamese government back there. You can discredit communism or whatever you want. So you strike two birds with one stone. You help some people, but also you gain in international reputation. Now, unfortunately, this is not the case for the Rohingya. They happen to be running away from Buddhist persecutors. In Europe, half of the people cannot imagine that smiling Buddhist people can, you know, commit such atrocities, you know. But then also the Rohingya having been depleted of citizenship means in terms of skills, literacy, they don't have much to offer. That makes them not a very much wanted target in the resettlement countries. But yet we do see some resettlements happening, but the numbers are probably way too small. And sometimes offers for resettlement materialize, but the Rohingyas are not too keen to go to a non-Muslim country. They rather want to stay in a Muslim country. That's important to them. They think that the community there is better for them in the long run than in a non-Muslim country. But, well, I suppose when it comes to creating change, it's always leading by example. You know, I mean, Germany was trying to do this when they allowed 1 million people to come into Germany in 2015, hoping that it convinced some of the neighboring countries to do the same. Well, it didn't really work. But again, when the Ukrainians came, we took them in as well. And of course, it's not just that we want to help them, but there is quite some calculation behind when it comes to soft power. If the Ukrainians go back in 1 year, 10 years or whatever, well, they probably were going to have good relationships with Germany. And since we are so afraid of Russia, you know, we need some good friends in between us and them. And of course, we could probably develop similar, narratives of why it is good to help refugees, why it's good to rescue people from drowning. You know, you might not get a reward immediately you might not get it in your lifetime, but creating good connections, might be a positive contribution for diplomacy, but also we're living in a connected world. Just protecting our own tiny interests and stakes is probably not the way to deal with, a globally connected planet. So, shall we take some more questions?
Yeah. What you say, I think it's not easy answer what's the future of the Rohingya, because the situation is really vulnerable, and the situations of politics in Southeast Asia still very hard to understand its situations, even though almost of all country actually already signed the human rights conventions, but still the way of the political governments in their own country is very hard. Yes. Okay. If you have any questions, would you? Okay. Tika and one more. Sorry, nama? Ahala. Okay. Tika and then Ahala. Mas Ahala. Silakan.
Okay, thank you, Guancho, for your interesting presentations. You mentioned about two sources of uncertainty, right? The first is imperfect knowledge, and the second one is the inability to predict the future. I'm just thinking that whether how do you think about multiple interpretation of policy or discretionary practices of policy? Could we put this issue as another uncertainty also, among refugee or asylum seekers? Thank you, Guancho.
Okay. Thank you, Anja. My question is about given the current situation, political situation in Myanmar, from Aung San Suu Kyi to junta military regime, do you think the approach made by the government is getting worse from Aung San Suu Kyi to junta military to the Rohingya people? And the second one, in your opinion, in the next 5 to 10 years, do you think that Rohingya will experience the same situation or getting worse, since the uncertainty inside the Myanmar itself is still we cannot predict the future? And yeah, what do you think about it, in your opinion? Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation for some speculation. But first, I want to briefly comment on the imperfect knowledge. I mean, that is probably one way for me to disguise that we don't know, and the Rohingya don't know what individual policies the governance will embrace. Like there's constantly experimenting with deterrence. There's not just one deterrence mechanism, but there's many. So non-assistance is one. Like you can always say like, oh, but I tried to help, but unfortunately I was late. And that makes it very difficult in terms of liability to say, but you're wrong and you're responsible that these people drowned, and there's more and more technology being used, like to early on make boats turn around. And whatever they're going to invent next year, maybe they're going to use drones or this or that to make sure that people are not coming on land. And this is, in a way, the imperfect knowledge. We don't know what governments are going to do next. Like in Europe, for example, they're now prosecuting civilian rescue missions, because there's no state-driven search and rescue any longer. The European Union deems that too expensive. A number of civilian groups, about 20 NGOs, they have chartered their own boats to go and find maritime refugees. But if you rescue a refugee boat, the government will now target you as a smuggler. Now, this is a legal change that probably was not anticipated 5 years ago. So this is also part of the not knowing, not being able to know, or maybe it's even unknowable to begin with, because by the time people start their journeys, that was just not predictable. So, but as you say, there is of course a clear connection between deterrence policies and uncertainty. Uncertainty can be increased and it can be lowered. For example, if governments anticipate that in the next, monsoon season, more boats will come, well, they could now prepare, equip all the search and rescue vessels, and then they will be ready to go out and rescue people. That is also one way of dealing with uncertainty. It's to prepare. The other way of preparing is that instead of equipping the search and rescue, we could also equip the Navy and the border protection, to make sure we can push them all back. And that, of course, comes back to political will. Like, what are the priorities here? Are we protecting people, human lives? Are we protecting borders? Like, what is it actually that matters to us? Like, what is the value that we give to other people's survival? Well, about the politics in Myanmar, well, honestly, I'm not an expert. I don't follow it too closely. You might have to ask somebody else who speaks the language and reads the papers and maybe reads between the lines of those papers. But I think the kind of outflow from the camps will continue if there's no change. I mean, that's probably something we can be fairly certain of, that if Rohingya remain in this kind of situation in the camps or on the island of Bhasan Char, they will look for other opportunities. And it's sometimes also what tempts them. They know the difficulties they have in their life and they imagine a better life. Somewhere life must be better. Here it's terrible. And I know maybe in Malaysia it's great, but I need to get there. I know it's very dangerous, but I'm prepared to take the risk because I don't want to live here in this horrible camp and die what they often describe as a slow death. I'm more prepared to take the risk and drown in the ocean. At least it's going to be fairly quick, but I will not stay here and not try anything. And this is why I think it's important to pay attention to agency. People are still making decisions. They make decisions to take on really high risk journeys, but that's what they do. And that's why we have to kind of react to that. It might look to us like a suicidal mission, but even 10% of survival, and 90% of like drowning in the ocean will not stop them. I don't think so. They will always think that they will be the lucky one. So, yep.
Yeah, it's a very interesting answer because too complicated when we talk about the Rohingya is no right answer with this one. I think we still one more questions. If there is anyone that really want to give a comment or questions. Okay, if not, we will stop here. But as you mentioned before, you will give once what's a book, something like that. Yeah, for one people that really give a good questions. So I think all very good. Or do you want to ask the questions? Oh, it's up to you because it's your book. So I think it's up to you.
No, it's a very easy question. I'm sure you can all answer the question. If you want to win the book, you have to tell who's the author of Bumi Manusia. I didn't see it. Please.
Okay. Oh, please. Okay.
Hey, my name is Sarah, and I work with Swaka. But right now, I'm actually curious. Just before that, I just really respect your work. Thank you so much for doing this field, Ibu Noga, as well. I know this is a very aggravating topic, and it's very difficult to research on, and it takes a lot, especially for women. It takes a lot of labor emotionally and mentally. So I would like to thank you on that. My question actually, it consists about like working conditions of Rohingya refugees in Malaysia, actually, because they've already acquired work permits there. How has that substantiated to their living conditions? That's it, really. And how would you think that it would progress in 5 to 10 years? Yeah, I think that's my question. Thank you so much.
Excellent question. And of course, also very much connected with the work I'm doing now with the colleagues from PRIN. So you're right. There was an experiment by the Malaysian government, and they granted work rights to Rohingya, a limited number, not all of them. I mean, there's 150,000, but I think they gave out, I don't know, 1,000 or 5,000 work permits. And at first, that of course looks like a really good idea to do, to allow people to earn their own living, you know, like to allow them to manage their livelihoods. But I think when you hand out work rights, you also have to hand out protection. There's no benefit in allowing people to work if you don't guarantee that they are being protected from abuse. And that's something we often witness in Malaysia, that labor protection is quite weak, and that then turns refugees into a kind of precariat, like very precarious people working in unsafe conditions, receiving very low salaries, so on and so on. So I think giving work rights is a good idea, but there needs to be a work right protection. So that needs to go hand in hand. But in the long term, it's probably a good idea. Not only you're going to be earning tax from, but you also make people less dependent on, you know, charity and gifts. It's one way of enabling, you know, local integration. You might not want to call that local integration, but that's de facto what's happening. You know, like you give people the dignity to work and to earn their own living. Thank you for the question. So,
Okay, it is you give the book. Yeah. And you still have 3, just a gift. You can choose which one. No need question, just give. You give it to. Please, Ma, you can come here. You, because you are the winner. And how about the 3 of the body bags? Yeah, I think Kahala, bertanya, Ibu Evi tadi mana? Oh, Ibu Evi, ini untuk Ibu Evi. Pak Ibnu. Kasih, kamu aja yang kasih. Pak, dari Bu Evi.
Oh iya, ada Mas Ahala dari UIN Surabaya, terus Pak Ibnu, PRAK, dan Ibu Harfiah, PRW ya.
Ibu Evi, yang satu Bu Evi. Oh,
Selepas ini kita akan foto bersama ya, terutama yang dapat hadiah bersama dengan Prof. Ance.
Prof. Ance, yeah. Okay, yeah. Can you finish it now? Okay. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for your attention, for your coming. I think Professor Anja enlightens about the uncertainty concept. This really different with risk. It looks like similar, but it's different. And you give example with I think a very good example, the perfect example when we talk about the Rohingya situations that really vulnerable, and you give the context, external and internal. I think it's very good for us, and I do hope it's not the last time. So I hope you can stay here. No need to go back, to Germany. Thanks a lot, Mbak Anja. I do hope we can have another discussions. And again, thanks a lot for the Research Center of Politics, and also team OTM seminar is make it happen, and again with Ibu Sulis and others that really help this lecture happen. And again, thank you to Atika. What's actually the question? Many questions actually related with our works. I think it's really challenges for us. How to push around of us, how to protect the refugee and also asylum seeker, especially in Indonesia, and then make them a part of us as human life. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, and give applause to Professor Anja. Selamat siang.
Ya, terima kasih sekali lagi, beri tepuk tangan kepada Bu Neke dan Bu Ance. Mungkin di atas dulu tetap Ibu. Mungkin kita langsung foto bersama ya. Ya, ke seluruh peserta untuk bisa maju ke depan panggung untuk kita foto bersama.